The soft whimpers from the third floor of the Thornton mansion were rarely heard. Not by the bustling city below, not by the devout churchgoers who admired the family's piety, and certainly not by the society ladies who praised Elijah Thornton's well-raised daughters. Only the thick walls, a deaf nurse, and the girls themselves bore witness to the hushed cries, the heavy steps, and the profound, unsettling silence that truly defined the household dot in Salt Lake City. 1913. Prosperity bloomed under a scorching sun. The Thornton name commanded respect, a pillar of industry and faith. Yet, within their grand East-South Temple Street residence, a different narrative was quietly being etched, a story of shadows stretching longer than the gaslight dot. Where are you watching us from today? Let us know in the comments below. Tonight, we open the forgotten pages of a notorious Utah legend, beginning in the summer of 1913. Salt Lake City, Utah, in the sweltering summer of 1913, was a city caught between its pioneering past and a booming, electrified future. The air, heavy with dust from unpaved roads and the sweet, cloying scent of newly bloomed alfalfa, vibrated with the insistent clang of streetcars and the nascent rumble of automobiles asserting their presence. Trolley lines, an intricate web of steel and wire, crisscrossed the expanding grid, replacing the more leisurely pace of horse-drawn carriages with a modern efficiency. New buildings, constructed with a haste that often sacrificed charm for utility, reached skyward. Each brick laid a testament to the city's rapid growth and unyielding ambition. This forward momentum, however, did not touch every corner equally. There were enclaves, pockets of established wealth and tradition, where time seemed to move with a more deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness, and where the past clung to the present with a tenacious grip. East-South Temple Street embodied this old-world grandeur, a formidable avenue lined with the palatial Victorian homes of Salt Lake City's most esteemed families. These were not mere houses. They were statements, monuments of dark brick, intricately carved stone, and towering gables that pierced the clear Utah sky. Each residence, with its elaborate turrets and polished brass, seemed to guard the secrets of its inhabitants behind stained glass windows and heavy oak doors. Among these architectural giants, the Thornton residence held a singular prominence. It was not simply its sheer scale, a three-story fortress of a dwelling that commanded its corner plot, but the aura of impenetrable respectability that emanated from within its formidable walls. Elijah Thornton, at the age of 52, was the undisputed patriarch of this imposing domain. His influence extended far beyond the manicured lawns of his estate, reaching into the deepest veins of the state's economy. As the proprietor of 3 of the largest copper mines in the region, his name was synonymous with industrial power, spoken with a mixture of deference and awe in the smoke-filled boardrooms of the city. His substantial shares in the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad further solidified his position, making him a figure whose word held considerable sway in the nascent municipal council and the exclusive business circles that were actively shaping the future of Utah. Physically, Thornton was a man sculpted by self-discipline and an innate sense of command. His height, exceeding most men of his generation, was amplified by a military posture, an unwavering straightness that projected an unshakable resolve. His grizzled beard, a testament to his maturity, was always impeccably trimmed, framing a jawline that bespoke sternness. This was the public face of Elijah Thornton, a pillar of the community, a man of profound devotion who sat on various church committees, a tireless worker whose achievements were frequently celebrated in the local press, and perhaps most importantly in the public eye, a dedicated father to his 6 daughters. The Thornton girls were a familiar and admired sight within Salt Lake City society. Their appearances, carefully managed and always understated, created a consistent public image. On Sundays, their arrival at the imposing tabernacle, a procession of 6 figures in modest, yet undeniably high-quality garments, was a quiet ritual. They would file silently into the front pews, their backs rigidly straight, their hands clasped demurely, their gazes fixed ahead. Not a whisper, not a fidget disturbed their composure, a testament to what many considered exemplary upbringing. While their father attended the administrative meetings that followed the services, the girls remained in their seats, a collective portrait of quiet obedience. Their excursions to the bustling shops along Main Street were equally orchestrated. Always accompanied by their governess, a stern but unobtrusive figure, they moved through the crowded sidewalks as a silent, well-ordered unit. Their dresses, though devoid of the more flamboyant embellishments of fashionable society, were cut from fine fabrics, their hems always clean, their ribbons perfectly tied. Onlookers and shopkeepers alike frequently remarked upon their demure demeanor, their quiet politeness, and the noticeable, almost preternatural stillness that defined them. "Mr. Thornton has truly raised them well," the elder ladies of society would often affirm, their voices laced with approval, convinced they observed the fruits of a pious and disciplined household. Among the six, the three eldest sisters were a study in practiced composure. Catherine, at 18, maintained a gravity beyond her years. Her brown hair, always secured in a severe, tightly bound bun, added to an already reserved air, enhancing the perception of maturity and diligence. Anne, also 18, born a mere 2 months after Catherine, possessed eyes of a striking, clear blue. Yet these eyes were rarely seen to fully engage, preferring to remain cast down, observing the patterns in the polished floorboards, or lost in the pages of a well-worn hymnal. Elizabeth, 17, presented an even more delicate figure. Her complexion was often pale, her movements sometimes hesitant. Her frequent absences from public view were courteously explained away as nervous ailments, a gentle euphemism for a delicate constitution, keeping her confined to the seemingly serene interiors of the mansion. The three younger sisters Mary, 14, Grace, 12, and Ruth, 9, still retained vestiges of a more innocent vivacity. Their movements held a slight spring. Their occasional hushed giggles, quickly suppressed, hinted at a fading childhood that their older sisters seemed to have shed years ago, like an unwanted skin. Yet behind the grand facade of the Thornton mansion, beyond the scrutiny of society, a starkly different reality resided. The meticulously polished halls, the ornate parlors, and the echoing staircases contained more than just the visible symbols of immense wealth. They also held an invisible, suffocating weight. On the third floor, intentionally isolated from the main flow of household activity, a faint, almost imperceptible murmur could sometimes be detected. It was a sound that rarely penetrated the thick, soundproofed walls of the nursery, a room that few outside the immediate family ever visited, and fewer still ever questioned. It was within this confined space that Catherine, the eldest, spent long, arduous hours. She moved with a subtle, almost imperceptible stiffness, her slender frame attempting to contain a secret that had become increasingly difficult to conceal. 6 months into another pregnancy, her body, already delicate from past ordeals, strained further beneath the increasingly voluminous dresses meticulously chosen to mask her growing belly. The child she already mothered, a 2-year-old infant, occupied a small, exquisitely carved bassinet near a window that overlooked the sprawling, immaculately manicured lawns of the estate. Anne, her contemporary in age and in suffering, shared a similar hushed burden. Her own infant, barely 1-year-old, occupied an adjacent crib, its soft breathing the only true innocent sound in the room. Elizabeth, the youngest of the three, navigated the mansion with a perpetual pallor, a subtle tremor sometimes visible in her hands. Her 4-month pregnancy, an additional weight, both physically and psychologically, seemed to amplify the fragility that already defined her movements. These 3 young women traversed the grand mansion, not as its mistresses, but as automatons, their days a relentless, exhausting cycle of duties. The meticulous domestic tasks that their father demanded, each chore executed with precise, unthinking efficiency, consumed their mornings and afternoons. They moved through the grand rooms, dusting, polishing, arranging, their hands performing rote actions while their minds were elsewhere, fragmented by a deeper terror. Upstairs, from the sanctuary of the 3rd floor, the soft, plaintive cries of the infants often called to them, demanding a different, more primal form of attention. The nurse, an older woman specifically hired from outside the state, moved through the nursery with a quiet, efficient rhythm. Her deafness was a meticulously chosen attribute. She heard little, asked fewer questions, and her perpetually kind but distant gaze seemed to absorb even less of the unspoken truth that permeated the air. She was a silent, unseeing guardian, a convenient presence that allowed the unspeakable to continue in plain sight. But it was the nights that held the most profound, inescapable terror. As the sun dipped below the Wasatch Mountains, casting long, bruised shadows across the city, an oppressive quiet would descend upon the Thornton mansion. The grand staircase, usually silent, would begin its dreadful nightly performance. The subtle creaking of the aged wood underfoot, amplified in the pervasive hush of the late hours, announced a dreaded ascent. Each heavy, measured footstep would echo, a slow, deliberate march towards the second-floor bedrooms where the sisters awaited. Then, the almost imperceptible pause on the landing. The soft, chilling click of a door latch being turned. The muted, dreadful sound of a heavy door slowly swinging inward. No screams ever escaped the thick, sound-absorbing walls. No pleas for mercy ever pierced the night air. Only the pervasive, suffocating silence that descended upon the mansion, broken only by the distant, almost unnoticed whimpers of infants on the floor above, sounds that were quickly muffled by the nurse or the desperate efforts of their young mothers. Each morning, as the first rays of dawn touched the ornate windows, the three older sisters would reappear in the dining room, their faces carefully constructed masks of composure. Their eyes, however, seemed a little more hollow, ringed with shadows that no amount of sleep could banish. Their movements, though still precise, carried a subtle tremor, a stiffness that hinted at an unseen strain. They would take their places at the breakfast table, their backs straight, their gazes fixed, ready to resume their daily duties. The careful, almost perfect facade of the Thornton family, so meticulously cultivated for public consumption, was, within the confines of its grand, silent walls, an intricate and horrifying illusion, maintained by an unbearable, unspeakable reality. The profound, suffocating silence that settled upon the Thornton mansion each morning, masking the terror of the previous night, was not a recent phenomenon. It was a silence that had been carefully cultivated, year after year, built upon a foundation of convenient disappearances and swiftly forgotten questions. The grand residence on East South Temple Street, with its intricate gables and polished facade, had witnessed a recurring tragedy, a pattern of loss that, to the external world, seemed merely the cruel hand of fate befalling a man of immense respectability, not Elijah Thornton. The lauded patriarch had been a widower 4 times over. Each death, a dark punctuation mark in the family's history, had occurred with a troubling regularity. His first wife, Catherine's mother, had succumbed to typhoid fever, a common scourge in the early 20th century. Her passing, though mourned, was seen as an unfortunate yet understandable consequence of the era's medical limitations. The city offered its condolences, and Elijah, in his deep black mourning clothes, accepted them with a bowed head, his sorrow a visible, almost theatrical display. His second wife, Anne's mother, met her end less than 2 years later. The official account spoke of a tragic accident, a misstep on the grand staircase, a tumble from the polished banister to the marble floor below. Neighbors recalled hushed conversations. A brief flurry of activity by local constables who arrived, noted the circumstances, and left within hours. The investigation was superficial, the conclusion swift. A lamentable accident. Again, Elijah Thornton appeared devastated, his grief now etched deeper into his prominent features. He commissioned an elaborate marble headstone, a testament to his enduring love and loss, and wore a black armband for months, a silent declaration of his perpetual mourning. The third wife, Elizabeth's mother, followed some years later, her life claimed by what doctors termed sudden pneumonia. The illness, observers noted, had struck with an alarming swiftness, leaving little time for intervention. Whispers, faint and easily dismissed, circulated among the servants, speaking of a rapid decline that seemed to defy the usual course of the ailment. But Elijah's reputation was unblemished. He was seen as a man plagued by ill fortune, a devout soul whose trials only deepened his faith. The funeral was grand, attended by the city's elite, and the condolences poured in, bolstering the image of a man enduring an unimaginable string of personal tragedies. No one dared to question the timing, the convenient nature of each demise. To do so would have been to question Elijah Thornton himself, a man whose public persona was as unyielding and pristine as the marble of his church. The fourth wife died in 1910. Her passing recorded as complications from a persistent fever. By then, the pattern was almost unremarkable to the general public. Another unfortunate loss for the benevolent Mr. Thornton. His outward displays of grief were as precise and predictable as the tolling of the church bells, each performance solidifying his image as a man beyond reproach, a victim of circumstance rather than its architect. The superficial inquiries into each death, conducted with a deference to his social standing, were always quickly concluded, the official reports filed away in dusty archives, gathering silence. Who, indeed, would dare suspect Elijah Thornton, a man of such standing and piety? He wept at the funerals, spent fortunes on ornate headstones, and observed protracted periods of public mourning, each act a deliberate brushstroke on the canvas of his unassailable reputation. 6 months following the burial of his fourth wife, the pervasive silence within the mansion began to twist into something far more sinister. Catherine, at that time a girl of 15, moved through her days with the quiet resignation that was expected of her. One evening, the familiar creak of the grand staircase announced her father's ascent, but the heavy footsteps did not pass her door as they usually did. They paused. A soft click of the doorknob echoed in the stillness of the hallway, and the door to Catherine's bedroom, typically left ajar or with a soft lamp burning within, slowly swung inward. The dim light from the hallway framed Elijah Thornton's tall figure, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the polished wooden floor of her room. He spoke in a low, measured voice, a tone devoid of warmth, yet imbued with an unsettling authority. He explained that she was now the woman of the house, that with her mother gone, new responsibilities fell to her. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implication. He spoke of his empire, of the vast wealth tied to his mines and his railroad interests, and of the absolute necessity for a male heir to carry on his legacy. He claimed that he would not entrust his lineage to an outsider, a woman not of his blood. His gaze, unblinking and devoid of emotion, fixed upon Catherine. He declared that she was his, always had been, ever since the day she was born, a chilling pronouncement that stripped her of any pretense of individual existence. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She tried to scream, a guttural sound that scratched at the back of her throat, but no coherent cry emerged. Her body began to tremble, a visible tremor that shook her from head to foot. It was then that Elijah Thornton reached into his coat pocket. He withdrew a small, ornate carving knife, its polished steel glinting dully in the dim light. The blade, narrow and wickedly sharp, caught the faint glow. He held it casually, almost playfully, asking in the same unsettlingly calm voice if she would prefer that he visited Mary instead. Mary, at the time, was only 11 years old. The question hung in the air, an unspoken threat that was more potent than any direct violence. The sight of the knife, the mention of her younger sister's name, severed Catherine's last link to resistance. Her trembling intensified, but no sound escaped her lips. The terror, cold and absolute, cemented her silence. 3 months later, the heavy footsteps paused outside Anne's door. Anne, at 15, had witnessed the subtle, horrifying shift in Catherine's demeanor, the way her sister's eyes seemed to hold a perpetual, unspeakable dread. The click of her own doorknob, the slow creak of her door, the towering shadow of her father filling the entrance, these were not new, but echoes of a terror she had already observed. A pattern of descent she knew was inevitable. She offered no resistance. Her silence, already practiced from years of living under her father's rigid rule, deepened into a profound, self-protective void. Then came Elizabeth's turn. At 14, still a child in so many ways, she too fell into the inescapable pattern. The whispers from the third-floor nursery, a place now perpetually occupied by the silent nurse and a growing collection of infant cribs, were a constant reminder of their shared plight. The visible changes in Catherine and Anne, the subtle shifts in their gait, the careful way they cradled their midsections, were not lost on Elizabeth. Each development, each passing month, was another layer of concrete poured around their shared prison. When the 2 babies were born, one after another, Both were girls. Elijah Thornton's reaction was not one of overt rage, but a chilling, silent fury that was perhaps more terrifying than any outburst. His jaw would clench, a muscle twitching almost imperceptibly at his temple. His dismissive glances towards the cradles in the nursery spoke volumes. He would spend less time observing the infants, his gaze instead shifting to the remaining daughters, a renewed, calculating intensity in his eyes. He needed a son, an heir to his vast empire, a male to carry his name. The silent declaration was clear. He would continue until he got one. The three older sisters found themselves trapped in a silent inferno, a living nightmare from which there seemed no escape. The possibility of revealing their father's monstrous acts was unthinkable, a desperate, fleeting thought quickly smothered by the sheer, insurmountable weight of his power and influence. Who in Salt Lake City, a community built on the unshakable foundation of faith and respect for figures like Elijah Thornton, would ever believe the word of three young girls against such an esteemed pillar of society? His connections ran deep, entwined with the city's legal, financial, and religious institutions. Any accusation would be met with swift dismissal, perhaps even outright ridicule. The social consequences of such a revelation were equally devastating. To speak out would not only destroy their father's reputation, but would shatter their own lives, leaving them in ruins. In 1913, such a scandal would brand them as pariahs, not victims. They would be seen not as survivors, but as complicit, as fallen women, as sinners who had brought disgrace upon a prominent family. The public would judge them harshly, their reputations irrevocably stained, their futures utterly annihilated. And then there were the babies. The two infants on the third floor, innocent and vulnerable, were a constant, aching reminder of the stakes. If the truth were to emerge, the authorities would undoubtedly intervene. The babies, seen as products of an illicit and scandalous union, would be taken from them, separated from their young mothers, and almost certainly institutionalized, condemned to a life within the harsh, sterile walls of an orphanage or asylum. The mere thought was a fresh wave of agony. Furthermore, the silent, unspoken pact among the older sisters extended to the younger ones, Mary, Grace, and Ruth. These innocent girls, still clinging to the last vestiges of childhood, would be irrevocably marked by the stigma. Their lives, already touched by the strange, somber atmosphere of the mansion, would be forever overshadowed by the scandal. Their marriage prospects would vanish, their place in society obliterated. The older sisters knew that their silence, however soul-destroying, was, in their twisted reality, the only way to protect what little remained of their family, to shield the younger ones from the corrosive reach of their father's crimes. The mansion, once a symbol of opulence and stability, had become a gilded cage, its walls echoing not with the sounds of a vibrant family, but with the profound, chilling silence of a secret too terrible to ever be spoken. The profound, suffocating silence that had encased the Thornton mansion for years, a silence born of terror and meticulously preserved secrets, began to fracture in the late summer of 1913. It was not a sudden rupture, but a slow, insidious crack initiated by the unexpected arrival of an outsider whose gaze, unlike the familiar, conveniently averted eyes of Salt Lake City, was both keen and unburdened by preconception. Dr. James Morrison, a young man of perhaps 28 years, arrived in Salt Lake City with a freshly minted medical degree from a reputable Chicago institution. His reputation, though nascent, was already growing, distinguished by a modern, scientific approach to medicine that was gradually challenging the more traditional practices of the conservative city. He was called to the Grand Thornton residence on East South Temple Street, not for an emergency, but for a recurring affliction that had long plagued Elizabeth, the youngest of the three older sisters. Her nervous ailments had intensified, manifesting as persistent fevers and episodes of sudden fainting, requiring a more attentive and perhaps more inquisitive medical presence than the family's long-standing, discreet physician. His initial visits to the mansion were marked by the usual polite formalities. Elijah Thornton, ever the picture of solicitous paternal concern, would greet Dr. Morrison with a firm handshake and a grave expression, expressing his deep worry for his delicate daughter. The interiors of the Thornton home were as immaculate as its exterior, every surface gleaming, every fabric pristine, reflecting an order that bordered on the austere. Yet beneath this veneer of perfection, Dr. Morrison, with the trained eye of a man accustomed to observing human frailty, began to notice small discordant details during his examinations of Elizabeth, conducted in her dimly lit, impeccably furnished bedroom. The young doctor observed her pallor, her rapid, shallow breathing, and a nervousness that seemed to transcend the usual anxiety of illness. He noted how her hands, often clasped tightly in her lap, would tremble almost imperceptibly, even when she was ostensibly at rest. More unsettling were the reactions of the other young women of the house when their father entered the room. A subtle stiffening would pass through Catherine's rigid posture. Anne, usually quiet, would visibly flinch, her blue eyes dropping instantly to the floor, her shoulders drawing inwards as if bracing for an unseen blow. Elizabeth herself would sometimes tense, her delicate features momentarily contorting before quickly smoothing into a mask of composure. These were not the normal interactions of a loving family. They were the guarded, instinctive reactions of individuals accustomed to fear. One afternoon, while examining Catherine for a minor complaint, ostensibly a lingering headache that allowed for a brief private consultation, Dr. Morrison's gaze lingered for a moment on her wrists. For a fleeting instant, as the sleeve of her dress shifted, he observed faint, discolored marks, almost healed, that seemed too perfectly circular, too uniform, to be accidental. They suggested a binding, a constraint that left an uneasy impression. He made no comment, his professional demeanor unwavering, but the observation settled in his mind, another piece of an increasingly disturbing puzzle. Each visit added to this collection of quiet observations. The almost too still demeanor of the younger sisters, the constant presence of the silent governess, the complete absence of any casual conversation or laughter in the grand, echoing halls. The air within the mansion seemed perpetually heavy, thick with an unspoken weight. Catherine, her rigid composure a practiced shield, felt the doctor's gaze, discerning in it something different from the usual polite indifference. He looked, truly looked, at her and her sisters, and in his eyes she perceived a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even a nascent concern. Desperation, a cold, constant companion, began to mingle with a fragile, dangerous hope. Justice, in the conventional sense, felt like a distant, impossible dream. The walls of her world, built by her father's power, seemed unbreachable. Yet this young doctor, with his gentle questions and observant eyes, represented a subtle shift in the unyielding landscape of her captivity. She began to engineer opportunities for clandestine encounters. The formidable structure of the Thornton household, while restrictive, also offered routines that could be subtly manipulated. The governess, a woman aged and increasingly reliant on the generous gratuities offered by Catherine, became an unwitting accomplice. During their infrequent, strictly supervised excursions into the city, Catherine would propose a brief reprieve, a moment to rest on a park bench while the governess, distracted by the lure of shop windows and the promise of a few extra coins, would drift away. Her limited hearing a further advantage. It was during these stolen moments, in the hurried privacy of public spaces, a quiet corner of Liberty Park, a secluded bench beneath a towering elm, a brief pause near the fountain in Temple Square, that Catherine began to reveal fragments of her carefully constructed facade. Dr. Morrison, always punctual, always discreet, would appear, ostensibly for a casual stroll. He did not pry aggressively, but he listened. He listened with an attentiveness that Catherine had not experienced in years, perhaps ever. He asked questions that were gentle, yet probing, and his responses, though careful, conveyed an understanding that transcended mere professional courtesy. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Catherine felt seen, heard, and, in a terrifying, exhilarating way, human again. A subtle softening in her rigid posture was sometimes noted. Her hands, no longer clenched, would rest with a fractional ease, and her eyes, though still guarded, would meet his for slightly longer intervals. The tension, a taut wire stretched to its breaking point, culminated on a day in early September. The air, though still warm, carried a hint of autumn's approach, a subtle coolness that was a deceptive contrast to the heat of the revelation that was about to unfold. Catherine had arranged a meeting in a particularly isolated section of Liberty Park, far from the laughter of children and the casual gaze of passers-by. She arrived, her movements stiff, her face pale, the increasing burden of her 6-month pregnancy evident beneath her voluminous dress. Her hands, usually so still, now trembled uncontrollably. Twisting a small lace handkerchief into a crumpled, damp ball dot as Dr. Morrison approached, Catherine rose, her gaze fixed on a distant point, as if summoning an unseen strength. She began to speak, her voice a low, strained whisper, barely audible above the rustling leaves. She did not describe her experiences directly, as much as she presented a series of stark, horrifying facts. She spoke of the pervasive fear, the hushed cries from the 3rd floor, the constant terror that permeated every waking and sleeping moment within the Thornton mansion. She revealed the existence of the infants, of her own advanced state of pregnancy, and Elizabeth's, confirming the deeply unsettling truth that had begun to coalesce in Dr. Morrison's mind. She conveyed the sheer, unimaginable extent of her father's crimes, a narrative of abuse and coercion so profound that it chilled the warm September air. Dr. Morrison's reaction was visceral and immediate. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a stark white, before a tide of crimson rose, suffusing his cheeks and neck with a furious flush. His body stiffened, his jaw clenching, and he made a sudden, decisive movement, rising abruptly to his feet, turning as if to stride immediately towards the nearest streetcar, presumably with the intent of reaching the police station. His professional calm shattered, replaced by an incandescent rage. Catherine moved with surprising speed, her trembling hand shooting out to grasp his arm, her grip surprisingly strong in its desperation. Her eyes, wide with a raw, primal fear, pleaded with him to stop. She spoke, still in that strained whisper, conveying the sheer, unshakable power of her father, a vast, insidious web of influence woven deep into the city's legal, financial, and ecclesiastical fabric. She described how any open accusation, any public revelation, would not only be dismissed, but would utterly destroy them all. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of the inevitable consequences, the ruthless public scorn, the unyielding judgments of society, the innocent babies torn from their mothers' arms and condemned to the harsh, impersonal walls of institutions the younger sisters irrevocably marked, their futures annihilated by a scandal they did not create. She conveyed the impossibility of seeking conventional justice, the futility of relying on a system that would inevitably protect a man of Elijah, Thornton standing over the word of 3 disgraced girls. Then her grip on his arm tightened further, her gaze meeting his with an intensity that held both despair and a nascent, desperate resolve. She conveyed that a plan had been carefully formulated, a meticulously calculated series of actions designed to extricate them from their nightmare. Its execution, she explained, would require his assistance, his quiet, discreet help. She did not elaborate on the true, horrifying nature of this plan, allowing the unspoken weight of their situation to suggest a solution that, though radical, stopped short of outright murder in the doctor's mind. She conveyed only that this path, however unconventional, was the only one that offered any hope of true liberation, a chance for survival beyond the suffocating shadows of the Thornton mansion. Dr. Morrison, still reeling from the confession, listened, his fury tempered by the profound and impossible dilemma that now lay before them. The profound, suffocating silence that had long defined the Thornton mansion, a shield against external judgment and a cage for its inhabitants, was poised to shatter. For weeks, Catherine, the eldest daughter, moved with a newfound chilling deliberation. Her desperation, a cold and constant companion, had sharpened into a calculated resolve. She had been preparing, meticulously, for the night of September 23, 1913, a date she had marked not on any calendar, but in the grim certainty of her heart. Her plan, conceived in the quiet torment of her waking hours, aimed to mimic a tragic accident, a catastrophic fire, consuming not only the mansion's patriarch, but also the incriminating evidence of his demise. From the various prescriptions left by the family physician for her own and Elizabeth's nervous crisis, Catherine had surreptitiously accumulated small, precious quantities of laudanum, a potent sedative, storing the dark liquid in a discreet vial tucked away in a hidden compartment of her dressing table. She had also observed, with the keen, methodical eye of someone trapped, her father's nightly routines. Elijah Thornton, a man of rigid habits in public, indulged in a private ritual, late nights in his expansive first-floor study, a space dominated by dark wood and leather, where he would smoke his imported cigars and consume liberal quantities of bourbon, often succumbing to a heavy, alcohol-induced slumber in his favorite armchair. This predictable descent into unconsciousness was the linchpin of her desperate design. The air on the fateful night of September 23, 1913, hung unusually still over Salt Lake City. The typical evening breeze that swept down from the Wasatch Mountains was absent, leaving the atmosphere heavy, almost expectant. Within the mansion, a familiar, unsettling pattern began to unfold as the city lights dimmed one by one. Elijah Thornton, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the grand staircase, commenced his dreaded ascent. The sound, a dull thud against the polished oak, resonated through the silent house, each step a hammer blow against the fragile composure of his daughters. He passed Anne's door, then Elizabeth's, his presence a palpable weight in the darkness. The footsteps paused, not for the first time, outside Catherine's room. A soft, chilling click of the doorknob echoed in the hushed corridor. The door, a heavy slab of oak, slowly, inexorably swung inward in the hallway. A few yards away, Elizabeth, 17 and 4 months pregnant, stood pressed against the cold wall. Her body was a rigid line of terror, and a silent, unending stream of tears traced paths down her ashen cheeks. Her lips moved, forming no sound, a silent plea perhaps, or a desperate invocation. Her shoulders shook with suppressed sobs, her hands clutching at the fabric of her nightgown as if to tear it. She did not dare to look towards Catherine's doorway, her gaze fixed instead on the patterns of the intricate wallpaper, finding no comfort there. In her own room, a few doors down, Anne, also 18, had long since barricaded herself. A heavy, antique chest of drawers had been dragged across the floor, its scraping sound a testament to her frantic efforts to block her door. Her hands were pressed tightly against her ears, her fingers digging into her temples, in desperate attempt to muffle any sound that might penetrate the thick wood, to block out the very possibility of the unbearable occurring. The stifled cries of her 1-year-old infant from the third-floor nursery, a faint, almost imagined sound, added to the cacophony of her internal despair. Time stretched, an agonizing, unquantifiable span. After what felt like an eternity, the heavy thud of Elijah Thornton's descending footsteps finally broke the oppressive stillness. They receded, growing fainter, until the distant, almost imperceptible sound of his study door closing on the first floor marked his return to his private sanctuary. Catherine waited. Half an hour crawled by, each second a leaden weight in the silent, suffocating air of her room. The mansion had settled back into its customary hush, a deeper, more profound quiet, following the storm of her father's presence. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Her eyes, wide and unnaturally bright in the dim light, scanned the shadows of her room. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she rose from the edge of her bed. Her feet, bare and cold against the polished floorboards, moved without a sound. From atop her ornate dresser, she retrieved a heavy bronze candelabra, a decorative piece with 5 branching arms, usually holding flickering candles. Its weight, substantial and cold in her grasp, felt solid, almost reassuring in its metallic density. Its polished surface, usually reflecting the warm glow of lamplight, now absorbed the faint moonlight filtering through the window, appearing dark and formidable. Gripping the cold metal firmly, she moved to her door, pushing it open soundlessly, and began her descent up the grand staircase. A familiar enemy yielded no creaks under her careful, deliberate weight. Each step was taken with an unnatural stillness, her bare feet silent against the expensive runners. The rich tapestry, the polished banister, the framed ancestral portraits that seemed to watch her descent, all were absorbed into the vast, silent tableau of her resolve. She reached the ground floor, the study door, slightly ajar, casting a thin sliver of yellow light onto the dark hallway. She approached the opening with measured steps. Through the crack, She saw him. Elijah Thornton was as she had anticipated, slumped in his large, high-backed leather armchair, his head resting heavily against the cushions. His breathing was deep, labored, the telltale sign of a man in a deep, alcohol-induced sleep. A half-smoked cigar, still emitting a faint, reddish glow from its tip, rested precariously on the edge of a crystal ashtray on a small side table. Next to it, a cut-glass decanter, more than half empty, stood beside a single, empty tumbler. The scent of stale bourbon and rich tobacco hung heavy in the air, a familiar, oppressive smell that she had associated with her father for as long as she could remember. Catherine stepped into the room. The floorboards, usually quiet, groaned faintly under her weight. Elijah Thornton stirred slightly, a soft, indistinct murmur escaping his lips, but his eyes remained closed, his slumber unbroken. Catherine approached the armchair. Her eyes, fixed on her father's grizzled head, held no discernible emotion. Her breath hitched, a faint, almost inaudible sound in the heavy silence. She lifted the heavy bronze candelabra. It felt impossibly light, then impossibly heavy, in her trembling hands. The first blow was delivered with a desperate, all-consuming force, a lifetime of suppressed terror and pain pouring into the arc of the heavy metal. The sound was not the clean, sharp crack of a breaking object, but a sickening, muffled thud, followed by a wet, tearing sound. A low, guttural groan escaped Elijah Thornton's lips, a sound of confusion and pain. His eyes, clouded with alcohol and the sudden shock, flickered open, registering only a vague, bewildered understanding before the second blow descended. Blood, dark and viscous, began to ooze from his scalp, tracking down his temple and into his perfectly trimmed beard. Catherine struck again, and again, and again. Each swing was fueled by an instinct beyond rational thought, a desperate, final act of self-preservation, the horrifying. Repetitive thudding sound, combined with the low, gasping moans that emanated from the study, was a noise that could not be entirely contained. It carried through the silent halls, a discordant rupture in the mansion's carefully maintained quietude. Anne and Elizabeth, drawn by the unspeakable sounds, emerged from their rooms. Elizabeth, her face still wet with tears, her eyes wide with a mixture of dread and morbid fascination, appeared first in the study doorway. Anne, her movements cautious, hesitant, followed closely behind, her gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before her. They stood, transfixed, in the doorway, their eyes falling upon the grotesque tableau. Catherine, covered in splatters of dark blood, stood panting over her father's slumping form, the bronze candelabra slipping from her trembling, blood-soaked hands. Elijah Thornton, his head a mangled mess, still convulsed slightly in the armchair, a horrifying, involuntary twitching that indicated a life stubbornly clinging to its last threads. The air was thick with the coppery scent of fresh blood and the cloying smell of bergamot. It was Elizabeth, the most fragile of the three, who moved first. Her face, devoid of color, seemed almost serene in its shock. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on her father's still gasping form. With a slow, deliberate motion, she reached out, plucking a velvet cushion from the nearby sofa. Her movements were dreamlike, precise. She walked to the armchair, her gaze never leaving Thornton's face, and without a word, pressed the soft, dark cushion against his nose and mouth. The convulsions under the cushion intensified for a few agonizing seconds, a muffled struggle that spoke of a final, desperate gasp for air. Then, slowly, the movement ceased. The body went utterly, completely still. Silence, a new, heavier silence, descended upon the study. The three sisters stood, side by side, their breathing ragged and shallow, their gazes fixed upon the lifeless form of their father. For long moments, they remained utterly paralyzed, suspended in the aftermath of their horrifying act, their minds struggling to comprehend the irreversible reality. Then Catherine, her eyes still holding a distant, unfocused terror, slowly began to move. Her plan, only half executed, still demanded completion. She picked up the decanter of bourbon, its weight familiar in her trembling hand, and began to pour its contents over her father's body, saturating his clothes, the armchair, and the surrounding rug with the highly flammable liquid. The scent of bourbon intensified, mixing with the metallic tang of blood. Her hand, moving with a desperate urgency, then reached for the cigar still smoldering on the ashtray. Its glowing tip, a tiny ember of destruction, seemed to pulse in the dim light. She held it over the bourbon-soaked fabric, her hand hovering, poised to drop it, to complete the final, annihilating step. But then, a sudden, paralyzing image, perhaps of the silent third floor, where her younger sisters, Mary, Grace, and Ruth, slept in their undisturbed beds, caused her hand to freeze. The thought of the raging inferno, of the entire mansion consumed by flames, with the innocent, unwitting girls still inside, brought a fresh wave of horror that eclipsed even the unspeakable act she had just committed. To kill their oppressor was one thing. To burn their home, to risk their lives, to compound tragedy with another, greater one, was another entirely. The carefully constructed logic of her plan fractured. Her hand trembled violently, and the smoldering cigar, instead of dropping onto the bourbon-soaked clothes, landed clumsily in the ashtray, its glowing tip quickly snuffed out against the cold crystal. The moment passed. The fire would not come. The destruction, however necessary it once seemed, would not be complete. With the first faint hint of dawn painting the eastern sky, a pale, anemic light began to filter through the study windows. Catherine, her movements still automatic, almost mechanical, made a futile attempt to clean the blood. She found a rag, a bucket of cold water, and began to scrub at the dark, sticky stains on the rug, on the chair, on her own hands. The effort was futile, the blood too pervasive, too deeply ingrained. The stark reality of what they had done stood undeniable dot as the sun's first. Weak rays touched the windows of the Thornton mansion, casting long, accusing shadows across the polished floors. The three sisters stood in the grand foyer. Their clothes were stained, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes holding a profound, unseeing emptiness. Without a word, a silent, unified front of despair and grim determination, Catherine, Anne, and Elizabeth walked out the heavy oak doors, descended the wide stone steps, and began the long, silent walk towards the Salt Lake City Central Police Station. They went to confess everything. The silent, unified front of Catherine, Anne, and Elizabeth as they walked towards the Salt Lake City Central Police Station on that nascent September morning, their clothes stained, their faces stark with revelation, marked the beginning of a profound rupture in the city's carefully constructed social order. Their confession, delivered with a chilling, factual detachment that belied the horror of their words, was met initially with a profound, almost instinctual disbelief. The officers, accustomed to the routine transgressions of the city, found it unfathomable that such accusations could be leveled against Elijah Thornton, a man whose public image was as unblemished and commanding as the highest spires of the tabernacle. Who would dare to believe three young women, distraught and blood-splattered, against a magnate of his stature? The initial reports in the local newspapers were cautious, bordering on skeptical. They spoke of a tragic incident at the Thornton residence, a disturbing discovery, but conspicuously avoided naming the accused or the nature of the alleged crime. Public opinion, swayed by years of admiring reverence for Elijah Thornton, initially leaned towards the incomprehensible. Rumors circulated, suggesting mental instability among the girls, a collective hysteria. Some whispered of a desperate attempt to seize control of their father's immense fortune. The power structure of Salt Lake City, interwoven with Thornton's influence, seemed to brace itself, preparing to absorb and dismiss this unthinkable challenge. However, the relentless, factual machinery of the law, once set in motion, began to uncover truths that even the most determined skepticism could not easily dismiss. Medical professionals were dispatched to the Thornton mansion. Their examinations of Catherine and Elizabeth yielded irrefutable physical evidence. Both young women were indeed pregnant, Catherine 6 months along, Elizabeth 4. The discovery alone was a shock that rippled through the constrained social circles of the city. Further, the two infants found nestled in their cribs on the mansion's sequestered third floor were also subjected to a meticulous medical examination. The findings were stark and horrifying. Clear physical evidence of consanguinity, a genetic marker, pointing unmistakably to a shared, immediate paternal lineage with Elijah Thornton himself. The whispers, which had previously dismissed the girls as hysterical, now began to turn, hardening into gasps of horror. The pivotal turning point arrived with the testimony of Dr. James Morrison. His professional credibility, enhanced by his recent arrival and lack of prior entanglement in Salt Lake City's intricate social webs, lent his words an undeniable weight. He recounted Catherine's desperate confession in Liberty Park, her terror-stricken plea for help, and the undeniable signs of abuse he had observed during his visits to the mansion: the flinching of the girls, the subtle marks on Catherine's wrists, the pervasive fear in Anne's eyes. His calm, clinical recounting of Catherine's desperate appeal for help, and her subsequent revelation of the unspeakable, provided the crucial context that transformed the narrative from one of incomprehensible accusation to one of harrowing, undeniable truth. The tide of public opinion shifted dramatically and irrevocably. The initial skepticism evaporated, replaced by a wave of profound sympathy for the young women, and an incandescent fury directed at the fallen titan Elijah Thornton. The newspapers, now liberated from their initial caution, screamed headlines of incest and abuse, detailing the gruesome findings within the mansion. The pillar of the community had crumbled, revealing a monstrous depravity beneath its polished exterior. The prosecutors, faced with a legal situation of unprecedented complexity, found themselves caught in an impossible dilemma. Technically, the actions of Catherine, striking her father repeatedly with a candelabra, and Elizabeth, smothering him with a cushion, constituted premeditated murder. The law, in its cold objectivity, demanded retribution for such a crime. Yet, the overwhelming public sympathy for the young women, cast as victims driven to an unimaginable act of self-preservation, made an aggressive prosecution politically and morally untenable. To pursue the full extent of the law against them would have been to fly in the face of a community utterly galvanized by their plight. The legal system, though designed for impartiality, could not ignore the raw emotional landscape. The trial, though swift, was a spectacle that gripped the entire state. Every available seat in the courtroom was filled, and crowds gathered outside, desperate for any news. Witnesses testified to Elijah Thornton's impeccable public persona, a stark contrast to the horrifying medical evidence presented. The details of the girl's suffering, relayed through carefully worded legal statements, and the stark clinical observations of Dr. Morrison, painted a devastating picture. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Their verdict, delivered with a quiet solemnity, declared Catherine, Anne, and Elizabeth innocent, not through simple acquittal, but by reason of temporary insanity and legitimate self-defense. They were released into the custody of the Church, which, eager to demonstrate its benevolence, and perhaps to distance itself from the scandal, pledged to provide them with shelter and psychiatric treatment, but legal absolution, it was soon discovered, could not grant psychological peace. The trauma, deeply etched into the fabric of their beings, remained an unyielding presence. Catherine, the architect of their desperate escape, never fully recovered. 3 months after the trial, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, a child conceived in horror. She could not bear to look at him, seeing only the visage of her father in his innocent features. The infant was immediately given up for adoption, whisked away to a new life, unburdened by the shadows of his birth. 6 months after the trial, in March of 1914, Catherine, a girl of 19 years, was found dead in her room at the church-administered retreat. She had hanged herself during the night, using the very bedsheets that were meant to offer her comfort. Elizabeth, the fragile 17-year-old who had delivered the final silencing act, suffered a complete nervous collapse after Catherine's death. Her already delicate constitution shattered, she retreated into an impenetrable world of her own. She spent the next 23 years institutionalized, her days marked by periods of lucidity interspersed with profound catatonia. She died in 1937, her mind never having fully recovered, her existence a silent testament to the lingering horror. Anne, though profoundly scarred, managed to construct a semblance of a life. She moved west to California, a world away from the pervasive judgment of Salt Lake City. She changed her name, shedding the burdened identity of Thornton, and eventually married a gentle, unsuspecting man who never learned the full terrible truth of her past. She carried her secrets, a heavy, invisible weight, until her death in 1961, taking them unspoken to her grave. The three younger sisters, Mary, Grace, and Ruth, were spared the immediate public scrutiny of the trial. They were swiftly adopted by a devout Mormon family in Idaho, far from the corrosive whispers and pointing fingers of the scandal. They grew up with new surnames, new identities, and new narratives crafted to shield them from the truth. Yet, the shadows of what they had witnessed, the chilling atmosphere of the mansion, the unspoken fear in their older sister's eyes, these memories, however suppressed, accompanied them. An invisible weight on their souls that the grand Thornton mansion, once a symbol of opulence and influence, became an instant pariah. It was sold in 1914 for a fraction of its immense value, a property no respectable family would consider inhabiting. The new owners, a couple of unsuspecting merchants from Chicago, moved in with enthusiasm, ignorant of its dark history. Their occupancy lasted only 4 months. The wife swore she heard heavy, deliberate footsteps in the first-floor study late at night, always followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy striking a hard surface, repeatedly. Her husband, despite countless attempts, could never fully scrub away the dark stains that mysteriously reappeared on the study carpet. No matter how many times it was cleaned, subsequent owners reported similar, unsettling experiences. A family in the 1920s quickly vacated the property after their young daughter began to speak of sad young ladies she saw in the second-floor corridors, figures who never spoke but watched with mournful eyes. In the 1930s, the mansion was briefly converted into a boarding house, an attempt to monetize its imposing structure. But it soon closed its doors when multiple guests complained of recurring nightmares involving a grizzled man who entered their rooms in the dead of night, his presence suffocating. The infamous structure was finally deemed unrentable, a blight on the prestigious street. It was demolished in 1947, its grand walls reduced to rubble. During the demolition, a chilling discovery was made. Hidden behind a false panel in the study, precisely where the patriarch had met his end, workmen found a leather-bound diary. It belonged to Elijah Thornton, its pages filled with a meticulous, clinically cold recounting of his actions, his justifications, and his chilling frustrations over the birth of daughters, horrified even the hardened, war-weary men who uncovered it. The diary was immediately confiscated by the Salt Lake City Police and remains sealed within its archives to this day, its contents too disturbing for public consumption. On the cleared ground where the Thornton mansion once stood, a modern office building was erected in the 1960s, a symbol of progress erasing a troubling past. Yet, the persistent whispers of a lingering presence continued. Companies refused to rent the upper floors, citing an inexplicable unease. Employees working late often avoid using the elevators alone at night, though none will publicly admit why. Nocturnal cleaning crews frequently request transfers after only a few weeks, muttering about doors that open by themselves and the unmistakable, heartbreaking sound of muffled crying echoing from empty rooms in the dusty, rarely consulted archives of the Salt Lake City courthouse. The trial transcripts of Catherine Thornton occupy 3 weathered boxes. On the final page of her testimony, a chilling question was recorded. Did she regret what she had done? Her response, meticulously transcribed by a stenographer whose hands reportedly trembled as she wrote, was stark and unforgettable. It simply read, "My only regret is that I did not have the courage to do it before he put another baby inside me." The shadow, it seems, persists. The final echoes of that Salt Lake City courtroom, on a day forever etched in the annals of forgotten horror, declared Catherine, Anne, and Elizabeth free. But freedom, it seemed, was a cruel mirage. For some, it led to a quiet, desperate end. For others, to a life shadowed by what could never be fully spoken. The grand Thornton mansion itself, unable to contain its dark truths, eventually crumbled into dust. Yet its spectral imprint remained, a chilling testament to the indelible scars left upon the very ground it once occupied. A new structure rose from its ashes, ostensibly erasing the past, but the whispers endured, carried on unseen currents, a legacy of sorrow manifesting in cold spots and phantom cries from empty rooms. Even the final defiant words of Catherine Thornton, buried in the court archives, serve not as a plea for pity, but as a chilling accusation against the facades of respectability that allowed such darkness to thrive. What remains, then, is not merely a chronicle of crime and its grim consequences, but a somber reflection on the elaborate facades we construct, the profound silences we enforce, and the lingering echoes of unspoken suffering. The crushing weight of hidden truths, once unleashed, can carve a path of devastation that outlasts even the sturdiest foundations, leaving behind only the cold whisper of what once was, a perpetual haunting in the landscape of collective memory got in a world where appearances held such absolute power. What, if anything, could have truly broken the silence of the Thornton mansion before it shattered so many lives? Share your reflections in the comments below. For more forgotten chronicles and chilling accounts from history's deepest shadows, consider exploring our other videos. If this descent into the enduring dread of the past has resonated with you, leave a like and subscribe to Host of Silence, where history's darkest corners always find their voice.